Welcome to part 2 of the Macro Unit 1 review. So this is taking a look at chapters 3 and 17. So let's get right to it. We're looking at supply and demand in chapter 3. And again, this is meant to kind of give you an overview of the chapter, some of the things if you need to delve into more detail, go back and take a look at. But here we're looking at supply and demand. Remember, a competitive market is when we have a point at which suppliers and buyers and sellers essentially meet at a market, an equilibrium, if you will. We have many buyers and sellers. They're selling the same good or service. This is the idea of imperfect competition. And the supply and demand model is made up of a supply curve, upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, meeting at an equilibrium point, meeting at a market created by which the buyers and sellers are willing to part with their goods and sell for those particular items. The example that Krugman gives in the book is this idea of a demand schedule, looking at the price of tickets for a hockey game in which Wayne Gretzky is playing, and how much the quantity will be demanded at various ticket prices. This essentially gives us a demand schedule, and that demand schedule essentially gives us a downward sloping demand curve. So at a higher price, we have fewer tickets that are demanded at that particular quantity. At a much lower price, however, you can see that the quantity demanded of tickets actually increases significantly. Now, these are based on people that are willing and able to buy those tickets based on those ticket prices. So that's what gives us our demand curve, this downward sloping curve based on the ticket prices. The lower the price, the greater the quantity demanded, and the higher the price, the fewer quantity demanded as a result of that, or the less quantity demanded that is taking shape there. So the idea here is if you have a particular price point, notice the demand schedule is what this is mirroring. So at a point of $250 a ticket, you have 8,000 of those tickets sold. But when that price drops to $100, all of a sudden 20,000 tickets are sold. And this gives us the law of demand. The idea that at a higher price for the good, other things equal, people are going to demand a smaller quantity of that good. So the quantity demanded is going to be smaller at a higher price. The quantity demanded will be greater at a lower price, and this is the law of demand. Now notice demand isn't shifting, it's the quantity demanded that is moving along the curve that is changing. And remember, that's a big difference between moving along the curve or movement along the curve and the shifting of the curve itself, which we'll get to in a minute. So why does the law of demand occur? Well, a couple of reasons. Remember, we've got the substitution effect. People don't have to buy this item. We're assuming perfect competition here, so we're assuming that people have options in terms of what they can produce, or what they can buy. They don't have to buy it necessarily, that particular product. They can substitute for another one. If the price of Pepsi goes up, I'm going to buy more Coke. Why? Well, because in a lot of cases, and I know a lot of people are purists about this, but the idea is the substitution effect. I'm not necessarily married to the brand. I can buy something else. Also with income, the income effect. If I make less money or there's a change in that income, I'm going to be less likely to want to pay a higher price for those particular items. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then the law of diminishing marginal utility is the idea that as I consume more of these items, my marginal utility or my satisfaction actually will drop. I don't need that third item or that third piece of pizza as much as I did the first one. So that's what really makes the difference here. So the substitution effect, as the price goes up for a product, consumers are going to buy less of it. We see that all the time. Coke versus Pepsi, the example that I gave you. The income effect, if the price goes down, I have more purchasing power. If the price goes up, I have less purchasing power. And the same is true for consumers in terms of their purchases. So if you're going to raise the price on them, the income effect says, well, I have less purchasing power. I may not be buying as much of that good. So the quantity of the goods that are sold will actually drop as the price goes up. And again, it's the quantity that's changing here. And then that satisfaction, that third piece of pizza, I don't get as much satisfaction out of that as I do from the first one or the second one. So the law of diminishing marginal utility will change and lead to this idea that, hey, maybe I don't need that third piece as badly as I needed that first piece, and I was willing to pay more for it. I'm less likely to pay more for those other items. So this is where we get to this movement along the curve. the idea of moving along the curve, when the price changes, the quantity demanded will change. But what's going to shift the curve? Well, that's going to lead to what we talk about in terms of what merits demand. This idea of using merit, kind of a mnemonic here, of market size, expectations, including future expectations of what demand will look like. Related prices of related goods, but remember, not the price of the good itself, because price is not a demand shifter when it comes to the good itself. So it could be a related price of a related good, but not the price of the good itself. And then income, obviously a change in normal income versus inferior income. You get laid off or whatever. Significant numbers of people getting laid off, like the recession that we're looking at now. That changes income dramatically. That's going to shift demand. It's going to shift demand inward. And then tastes and preferences. The idea of changing tastes and preferences can shift demand outward or inward, leftward or rightward, based on what we see there. And this comes down to playing this increase in demand would be a shift rightward or outward. A decrease in demand would be a shift inward or leftward as a result of that. So breaking down the idea of merit, then we've got substitutes that we can use in place of others. We've got complements that can be bought and used together in terms of prices of related goods that we see here. And again, income. If I've got a normal good, as income goes up, my demand increases for that good. As my income drops, my demand will fall for that good, and then I'll shift to inferior goods. If I'm making more money, I don't need the inferior good, the spam, for example, or buying lunch at McDonald's. But if my income increases, I may go to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, or I may go somewhere along those lines. So inferior goods, not as important in when income increases. It's when income falls that the demand for those goods would change. Now let's shift over to supply then. Looking at the supply schedule, this is an upward sloping supply curve, because as the price goes up, more people are willing to sell at those particular ticket prices. This is the profit motive. These are the ideas of incentives for suppliers. So what people are willing and able to pay at these ticket prices is going to determine how much we're willing to part with it, how much we're willing to sell it for as suppliers. Think of suppliers as businesses, as sellers, people that are selling products or services. And if there is a higher price being offered for that ticket, more tickets are going to be sold. More tickets are going to be supplied to be sold in addition. And then if the price falls, there are going to be fewer sellers, because there's no incentive to sell at $100 like there is an incentive to sell at $350. And that makes a big difference. So if you plot this, then it creates an upward sloping supply schedule. So you can see here that at $350, 8,800 tickets are supplied to be sold at that particular price. That doesn't mean that's where demand will meet, but the idea is there are enough suppliers out there to meet 8,800 tickets that could be sold at that price if the demand was there. Chances are probably not. And at $100, you only have 2,000 tickets that are supplied to be sold. So if the idea there is there's only 100 tickets out there to be $100 per ticket to be sold, chances are you're going to have you're going to have more people that want those items than the items that are available, and at that point, you're going to have a scarcity of resources. You would then result in not a surplus, but a shortage in that respect. So that would be the biggest difference that we see there. So a shift in the curve would move the supply curve to the left or to the right based on a big announcement, a big change, such as Gretzky's going to retire. Well, now all of a sudden, the number of games that are available to watch that hockey game and that hockey player in action is going to be very different, because there's an even scarcer number of games that you can actually get tickets for, because now there's a limited time at which he will be retiring, and then there will be no more games in which he will be playing. So that supply curve is shifting inward or leftward as a result of this announcement. And let's get to what is going to shift that curve and that capacity. Again, this isn't the same as moving along the curve, which we'll come back to in a moment, but the idea here is the same. Now, we have a mnemonic for supply as well, like we did what merits demand. Think trice for supply. This is a change in technology. Any technological innovation that changes the supply of a particular item, including a breakdown of technology, would move it leftward. New technologies that innovate and allow us to produce more would shift the supply curve rightward or outward. Related prices. This is the idea of government action such as taxes or subsidies that can shift the curve. Substitutes in production or complements in production can lead to related prices, which can shift the supply curve again leftward for negative actions and rightward for positive actions as a result of these related prices. Inputs, the price of inputs, the price of resources that are going into making these goods or services. Again, if the input prices are rising, your supply curve is going to be shifting inward. And if the input prices are dropping, then your supply curve will be shifting outward. So the availability of those resources also has an impact in shifting the supply curve here. Then competition, the number of sellers or producers. If people are going out of business, that's going to shift the supply curve inward. If more people are jumping onto the scene, that's going to shift the supply curve outward. And then again, changes in expectations. Significant changes here to expectations that could change the supply curve, such as coronavirus impacting more countries and more places around the world are closing. That expectation change is going to lead to an inward shift in supply curve. But again, remember, price isn't a curve shifter. Price of the good itself is not a shifter of supply, just like it's not a shifter of demand. It's going to move along the curve, which is what I was trying to address here. This idea of moving along the curve, not shifting the curve itself. So that would be a big difference. And again, price only moves along the curve for quantity demanded, not shifting the curve itself. So think price for supply. Okay, so then we get to the equilibrium. Let's put all this together at a market clearing price, or at a market, if you will, in terms of this equilibrium. This is where buyers meet sellers, supply curve meets demand curve, and in this example, we see it's at $250 at 8,000 tickets. So that is where we would have equilibrium. We would not have a shortage. We would not have a surplus. We would have a market in which all resources are used. All tickets that are supplied at that price would be sold, and all buyers that are willing to buy at that price would be able to find a ticket. That's the idea of a market clearing price or an equilibrium. And that leads us to this key graph, which is the idea of a perfectly competitive market for that graph. Now we see an equilibrium where upward sloping supply curve meets downward sloping demand curve at P1, a price level of P1, and at a quantity of Q1. This is productively and allocatively efficient as a result of this. So why does the market price fall if it's above equilibrium? Well, the idea here is if it's above equilibrium, you're going to end up with a surplus. You're going to end up with more than what you need. So you're going to move along the curve to that equilibrium price as a result of this. A surplus is ultimately going to push the price down until it reaches that equilibrium. Why? Because you have too much of it, and you're not going to sell it at $350 when the market is selling it at $250. So you're going to either have to lower your price, or you're going to be stuck with the item. And for those that would be demanding, why would you pay $350 when you could pay $250 and get the same ticket? So you're obviously not going to do that. Now, why does the market price rise if it's below the equilibrium price? Well, because here you have a shortage. If you're only willing to pay $150 for this ticket, chances are you're not going to get one. You're going to be one of the people that is left high and dry at this shortage because you're not going to be able to get that ticket as a result of that shortage. So here you're going to have to pay $250 or you're not going to get a ticket. You're going to be one of those that's left out in the shortage market. Okay, so what happens when the demand curve shifts? Obviously, the supply moves along the supply curve, but the demand is shifting outward or rightward here. This is leading to a movement along the supply curve and to a new equilibrium point at E2. The quantity is greater, the price is up, and you would indicate that on the side in the legend. Quantity greater, price greater as well. In terms of a supply curve shift then, again, demand moves along the curve, but the supply curve shifting, an increase in supply would lead to a rightward shift to S2 and a new equilibrium at E2. Again, demand moving along the curve. Here we have a greater quantity, but a lower price as a result of that. And go back to your graphing notebook. There's a number of these that'll take shape with the key graphs, but the idea behind this and it's important to study those key graphs to know what's happening in these examples, but here's an example of a demand curve shift in which supply is moving along the curve. Again, price is greater, quantity is greater as well. Here in this example, we see a demand curve shift inward or leftward, leading to a lower price and a smaller quantity as a result of this. And then in this example, we see a supply curve shift, and as a result of this, you have a higher price but a lower quantity. So it's important to know, and again, when in doubt, graph it out, but it's important to note that the price is rising while the quantity is falling as a result of this supply curve shift. So this could be a manufacturing plant for Apple iPhones leads to a shortage in supply, shifting the supply curve inward. A smaller quantity that's developed, and those that want those phones are probably going to pay a higher price for them in order to get them. So that's essentially what we see here. Now, and then we move on to this idea of simultaneous shifts, which is a very common object that we saw in this chapter when we looked at chapter 3. The importance of a simultaneous shift in supply and demand is, remember that whenever two curves are shifting, something is going to be indeterminate. It's either going to be price or quantity. That doesn't mean that that in all cases price and quantity will be indeterminate, but for our purposes, again, ceteris paribus, the assumptions we've made at the beginning of this, we have to assume that if two curves are shifting, something's going to be indeterminate, because it could be slightly up, it could be slightly down, but we really can't tell based on this graph. And if we're trying to simplify in order to determine what is happening, we're going to leave it at the fact that that something is indeterminate as a result of this. So in this example, just to take a look at this, notice demand is shifting much greater than supply. Well, for purposes of what we're doing in this course and in the College Boards class, they don't really give you indicators of how much of a shift is happening versus how much of how small of a shift the other curve is happening. You have to assume that if it's shifting, that they're shifting in the same proportions. So for AP Micro, AP Macro, the assumption is that the curves are shifting in the same proportions, that there's not a gradation of shifting there. We know that if demand is shifting and supply is shifting, something's happening, and as a result, one of them is going to be indeterminate. And in this case, because of what we see here with the curves shifting in different directions, in this case, we can see that chances are it's going to be price rather than quantity that's going to be, because price is going to be greater as a result of this, because supply curve shifting one way, demand curve shifting the other, basically negates the quantity that it's shifting, but not the price. They're both going to lead to a higher price as a result of that. And we'll look at that here in a key graph in just a second. But the idea here is if they're shifting simultaneously, and again, they're moving in different directions, Krugman talks a lot about the gradation of the shift here, but again, for AP exam purposes, if they're shifting at the same time, we're assuming that they're both shifting at the same rate, that there's no gradation of those shifts. And so that's what leads to this idea of a simultaneous shift in supply and demand. If demand increases and supply increases, it's going to be price that's indeterminate. If demand increases but supply decreases, this is where we see the example that we just saw, the quantity is going to be indeterminate. And again, when in doubt, graph it out. That's going to make it a lot easier here. When demand decreases but demand decreases but supply increases, you're going to see it's quantity that's indeterminate. And when supply decreases and demand decreases, it's price that's going to be indeterminate. And here's a couple of examples of that. If we look at this key graph 6, you have a supply curve shifting outward, you have a demand curve shifting outward. Well, as a result of this, you're going to have greater quantity because both are shifting outward. Quantity is going to be greater, but we don't know whether price could be up or down, so we assume it's indeterminate. And again, when two curves are shifting, something's going to be indeterminate, and we can clearly see quantity, the demand is greater, the supply is greater, quantity is clearly going to be greater here. It's price that's going to be indeterminate. Now, in this example, we've got supply and demand both moving inward. Again, quantity is falling, and it's going to be falling because supply is moving inward, demand is moving inward, and so quantity is going to be dropping. It's price again that's going to be indeterminate. In these examples, you've got, again, simultaneous shifts, but in different directions. In this case, it's going to be quantity that's indeterminate, because in this model, when demand is moving inward but supply is moving outward, the idea here is your price is going to be falling. If there's not as much demand but there's more product, your price is going to have to be falling. But they're basically negating each other in terms of the quantity that's taking place. So quantity in this example would be indeterminate. As it would in this example, same kind of thing, it's just they're moving in different directions. Demand is moving outward but supply is moving inward. Again, price is going up as opposed to going down as in the last model, but the idea is, again, price is indeterminate. Okay, go back and study the key graphs. I'm planning on doing a key graph YouTube video on that as well, to go back through the 37 graphs in macro and the 42 in micro, that I think will be very helpful. But studying those graphs will really be beneficial when you get to the AP exam itself. Okay, now we move on to chapter 17. So we're halfway through. Let's take a look at comparative advantage and international trade. Now you remember in the chapter 1 and 2 video, we did comparative advantage, kind of looking at the IOU and the OOU method. So we're not going to go back through that particular piece in this. If you want to go back and look at that, go back and watch the macro unit 1 part 1 video, or the micro unit 1 video, which has that in it. And I think you'll find that beneficial. But we're not going to study that here. We're going to talk about it, comparative advantage in relation to international trade. So in that video, we talked about it more in terms of the micro aspects of people using it, with a couple of world trade examples. But here we're looking at it strictly in terms of the macroeconomic point of view. So imports, things that we're bringing into our country, goods and services. Exports, the types of goods and services that we're actually selling to other countries or to people in other countries. And whoever can export the most has an absolute advantage, but whoever can export with the lower opportunity cost actually has the comparative advantage, and that's what we're looking at here. So a country having a comparative advantage is going to have a lower opportunity cost of doing so in producing those goods. Okay, so now the Ricardian model is essentially assuming that there is a trade-off between the two, that there's an opportunity cost, and essentially it's a straight line. If you remember key graph 2 in the key graphs was the point of kind of a straight line production possibilities curve. This is the Ricardian model of international trade. You're assuming that you have a production possibility frontier and it's a straight line. If you're not producing guns, you're producing butter, or vice versa, but the idea is it's a back and forth. Not necessarily always feasible, okay, because we're assuming, and in the purpose of micro and macro, we are assuming that it's just two goods that we're trading for simplification purposes. Again, key assumptions, we're assuming that things can be graphically pretty easily understood by graphing it out in a simple model. But there are a lot of cases in which that's not necessarily true, and in higher level economics courses, you can find examples of that where you're using more than two goods to look at comparative advantage models and that sort of thing, but we don't do that here. Now, autarky, another important concept, just the idea that you're not trading, or you can't trade with other countries. It could be because you have a traditional economy that is more based on hunting and fishing and that kind of thing, or you just physically, maybe you're on an island and you are primitive and more removed from other countries, that you can't physically trade with other countries as a result of that. Becoming harder and harder in today's globalized world to find a country in autarky where that really is the case, but nonetheless something that they want you to know here in terms of how that shakes out. Okay, so looking at a couple of comparative advantage models of the PPF for the United States and Colombia. We're looking at computers and roses here, and one of the things you can look at right off the bat before you even use either the IOU or OOU method, and in this case we have output, so we'd be using the OOU or the output other over method, but you can also look at the slope here, and the slope that favors a particular axis would also tell you that they have the comparative advantage in that product. For example, you can see that the slope here of -2 actually favors computers, so the United United States has a comparative advantage in computers, where in Colombia, the slope negative 0.5 actually is favoring roses. So Colombia has a comparative advantage in roses, the U.S. has a comparative advantage in computers, and so they should find gains from trade and specialize in those products in order to trade with each other. But if you didn't have that slope, you didn't have that information, you only had a graph or a table in which you were given that information, again, you could use the output other over method with 1,000 and 500 and then 500 and 1,000 to quickly determine that the same is true, that the United States has a comparative advantage in computers and Colombia in roses. Okay, so again, the Ricardian model is showing these countries have an advantage in gaining from trade, even with this straight line approach, which is essentially what we see here in the Ricardian model. If we're not building computers, we're selling roses, or vice versa. But the idea is there are gains from trade, and that's what the Ricardian model of international trade is trying to illustrate, that there is an advantage to specializing, and there are gains from trade as a result of it. That Colombia is going to benefit in terms of being able to consume beyond their PPF, and the United States is going to be able to consume beyond the PPF. Remember, we can't produce beyond the PPF, but we can consume beyond it if we specialize and trade with other countries in order to do so. And that's the point that they're trying to make here, is that the United States, while it can only produce 1,000 computers and produce 500 roses, they can now consume 1,250 computers and 750 roses, well beyond what their PPF was capable of. And Colombia, just the same. On the PPF, they can produce 500 computers and 1,000 roses, but if they specialize, then they can consume 750 computers, 250 more than they could have produced, and they can consume 1,250 roses as a result of this. So this is to both countries' benefit. Both are gaining from this international trade as a result of having a lower opportunity cost in the products that they're producing. So that really is the driver here. Now, what are some sources of comparative advantage in terms of leading to that lower opportunity cost? Well, the Krugman text talks about the idea that international differences in climate is a big one. Obviously, Alaska is not going to specialize in growing oranges, but a country in South America or a country in a state like Florida, for instance, would specialize in that. Why? Because the climate is much more apt to be able to do that. And Krugman mentions Chilean grapes, New Zealand apples. All of these are really great examples of climate differences that really, they have a lower opportunity cost in terms of raising those products. So those international differences really give them a lower opportunity cost in so doing, and the ability to be able to gain from that trade. Technology is another one. Why is it that when I talk about comparative advantage, a lesson that I taught when I was teaching in South Korea over a summer teaching program in Seoul was, should the CEO of Samsung grow his own rice? And the answer was no, of course not. He has a comparative advantage in technology, and technology is a huge one. Why is it that South Korea has really focused on education and technology in trying to improve its economy? Well, because it doesn't have the climate differences to be able to grow grapes and apples. It doesn't have the factor endowments of having oil underneath its feet. And so technology is really a way that they've differentiated and really found that as a comparative advantage. And that really has helped them to create some of the most amazing technological companies in the world, and really help them in that regard. But it definitely is a source of comparative advantage. And the last one here is factor endowments. The idea of having the availability of factor markets or factor resources, factors of production, such as oil or gas, natural gas, for instance. These are factor endowments. We're not creating these. We're just pulling them out of the ground. And so if you're in a country like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates that has oil underneath your feet, and it's just a matter of using capital and factor intensive resources to pull that out of the ground, well, then that's to your advantage. But it definitely is a source of comparative advantage. And it would be at a lower opportunity cost that they're doing that they're creating those particular comparative advantages, and there are gains from trade as a result of it. Now, that factor intensity I was talking about really is this idea of how capital intensive is pulling oil out of the ground. Well, for somebody like Seoul, Korea, almost impossible, right? Or Japan, for instance. I'm sure there's oil there, but not nearly in as great of quantities and as easy to access as in places like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and other Middle Eastern countries. So their resources are much more capital intensive as a result of this, and that is to their advantage. There are factors in terms of being able to pull that out of the ground that are going to cost more. But again, cost-benefit analysis, the price of those goods is also higher than what you would sell grapes for, grapes versus oil, for instance, so that the benefit is truly there to be able to pull that out of the ground and to do it at a lower opportunity cost. And we see this in all kinds of things, not just oil. Clothing is another good example. Manufacturing clothing at a lower opportunity cost because labor is cheaper in some places than in others. This is all the idea of how, and this is the Heckscher-Ohlin model, this idea of how we supply our factors of production and do it in a way that gives our country a comparative advantage. And that's what they're essentially talking about here. Now, I've never seen a question that actually asked about the Heckscher-Ohlin model, but I have seen questions that talked about the comparative advantage in terms of factors of production that yielded a lower opportunity cost and thus a comparative advantage. So they wouldn't necessarily call it by that name. I think that's more of a Krugman thing, but they do talk about the capital-intensive resources and trying to do to utilize those at a lower opportunity cost, thus giving them a comparative advantage and a gain from trade in so doing. Okay, so domestic demand then in terms of imports, and we're going to see this in some of the graphs we're looking at today. But if you think about the domestic demand curve, it's going to depend on the price of the good and what kind of demand consumers in your country have for this particular product. Domestic supply curve, same way. But what we're going to see is the price of that good domestically in autarky versus the world price can be higher or lower, and that can have an impact on whether you're going to import or export that particular good. And it's easier to show it than it is to kind of talk it out here with text. So I want to go to that in a second. But think about that in terms of the domestic price versus the world price, and then we'll come back to this particular model. Now, you may remember we talked about comparative advantage here, this idea of the slope. So in this example, country A has an advantage of producing product 1 because their opportunity cost is lower based on the slope we see here. I don't even need numbers. I can just eyeball that one. And then country B has a comparative advantage because it has a lower opportunity cost in producing product 2. So if they specialize, they can consume outside their PPF as a result of this, and that is essentially telling us where their comparative advantage lies. Now, going to the next key graph 15, we see here the consumer and producer surplus model. Anything above the price but below the demand curve will be the consumer surplus. Anything below the price but above the supply curve would be the producer surplus in these particular instances. And Krugman has basically laid this out. This is the price at autarky, so keep that in mind. This is the price at autarky if the country wasn't trading with anybody else for this particular product, and you were selling roses domestically as you were basically producing them or harvesting them. And the consumer surplus would be the willingness to pay up to and including all the way up to the demand curve. But they don't have to because they're paying at the price at autarky. Producers would be willing to sell it at a lower price all the way down to the supply curve, but they don't have to because they're selling it at the price of autarky. But world trade is going to change that because of specialization in this trade and the lower opportunity costs that we have here. We're going to see that can make a difference, both positive and negative. Okay, so in this example, notice the world price is actually below or beneath the autarky price, meaning the world price coming in is going to lead to a much lower price, which is going to be an advantage for consumers. Notice the consumer surplus before autarky was just basically at the price at autarky over to point A all the way up to the demand curve. But now consumer surplus is still that demand curve, but all the way down to the PW, the price at world price here. So a much larger consumer surplus. But notice the producer surplus has shrunk. It's all the way down the supply curve up to the world price. So a much smaller producer surplus. So what does this mean? Well, this means that a lot of rose producers domestically are probably either going to have to lower their price or go out of business. And you're going to be importing a lot more roses, and you're going to specialize in some other product. Chances are you as a country are going to specialize in another product. So this could be an example of what we looked at with the U.S. specializing in computers and leaving a country like Colombia to specialize in roses, because we can sell computers at a lower opportunity cost and make more money as a result of it. There is a gain from trade, but then we can import roses. And so this is a good example of that. So not as many rose producers domestically, but we're going to be importing a lot more roses in terms of what you see here in that capacity. Okay, so the effect then, as I mentioned, in the consumer surplus, you notice it's X and Z, and originally was W, right? And X and Z were the gains in terms of the consumer surplus. Y is what is left of producer surplus, so they lost all of X. And then the change in total surplus is all of Z. And I really don't like that they didn't label this triangle, but they're assuming that you're assuming that Z is all of this, I guess. But I think that's dangerous to assume. But anyway, the change in total surplus then would be Z. But again, it's at a cost to the producers, and the consumers gain from this particular trade. So that leads to the next key graph, which essentially is looking at this idea of autarky here and consumer surplus, but then a world price beneath the autarky price, which is kind of the model we just saw. So producer surplus shrinking to just number 3, consumer surplus increasing to 1, 2, 4, and 5. And again, if you need to stop that to take a closer look, please feel free as we keep moving in these. We have more graphs to cover. Okay, so the effect of exports then. If the world price is higher than autarky price, trade is going to lead to exports, right? And this is the model that we're going to see next, which is when the price is actually greater than autarky price, there's going to be gains from trade, but you're going to be exporting a lot more of those products because you could have gotten it domestically cheaper, but now you can charge a higher price, and so you're going to be sending more of those goods out of the country because there's an incentive, profit motive for you to do so. So this world price greater than autarky price, notice consumer surplus is going to get a lot smaller, but the producer surplus is going to get a lot larger. And as a result, you're not going to sell as much domestically because the domestic demand is going to shrink. Notice you're going to see a much smaller domestic demand here, but the domestic supply is going to be a lot greater. And so what are you going to do with this surplus that you have between the two? You're going to export it. You're going to send them out of the country. You're going to sell them to other countries, gains from trade, lower opportunity cost, and a greater profit motive or incentive to produce those items and ship them overseas. So that's what you're going to do. So as a result, what happens to the changes in consumer and producer surplus then? Well, you're going to see the consumer surplus shrinking. It loses all of X. You're going to notice that the producer surplus increases because it's going to include X and Z. And Z is going to be the addition of the surplus, the total surplus that we see here. So a much greater surplus. And again, all of that is going to be exports that's going to go out to other countries to be sold. And that leads to this key graph, which looks at that particular change. With the world price being higher, you're adding 4 and 5, and 2, 3, 4, and 5 being the producer surplus, consumer surplus shrinking to just number 1, and again, everything from Q1 to Q2 is going to be exported because the demand domestically will be smaller, but the supply will be quantity supplied will be greater. So all of that surplus will then be exported to other countries where it'll be sold at a higher world price. Okay, so obviously when this steps in and when world price is lower than autarky price, you have a lot of questions about, are you protecting industries? Are industries going out of business? What do you do to protect those industries? And this is the big question of free trade, right? When NAFTA was introduced and signed into law by Mexico, Canada, and the United States, it really was a question of, are we willing to give up a lot of manufacturing that's then going to go to Mexico at a much cheaper labor rate and as a result lose all those jobs? And the answer is, in a lot of cases, we said yes, because new industries are created as a result of that, and new jobs created, and leads to new industries, new innovation, new technologies, and ones that we have today that we didn't even have then. But it's not all rosy. I mean, obviously, economists look at it in a ceteris paribus kind of model, but those, we're talking about impacting lives there. When plants close, people lose their jobs, and it's really hard. They're structurally unemployed, as we know, so they find it hard to find new jobs. Maybe they even have to move in order to find a new job. So this really gets to the question of free trade. When should the government step in to provide some protections? And let's talk about some of the protections that they actually take a look at in so doing. So the first one is a tariff. That's a tax on imports, anything coming into the country at a lower price, which is what you would see there. Do they raise by slapping a tax on it? Do they raise the price to at least provide some measure of a buffer? It doesn't take the price all the way up to what the price was at autarky, but it definitely helps. And in so doing, does it help kind of slowly take these companies to a place where they can either adapt and change or go out of business, and the change is not quite so abrupt. So by placing a tariff on this, notice it still doesn't take it back to the autarky price at equilibrium. It's still not going to be there, but at least it's kind of helping the blow of a world price so low that it's helping some of those cottage industries that are domestic to be able to adapt and change or go out of business altogether over time, as opposed to everything happening abruptly right away. So this tariff that would be imposed, obviously at the world price, the domestic supply will be greater at that tariff price. The demand will be smaller than it was at the world price, obviously. And then what is the gap here, or the shortage between what's still demanded and supplied, would then be imported. So this would be the import, and the difference of that import would then go to the government. The tariff would go to the government in that particular case. So what do we see here? We see a new addition to our surplus map, and that is with the change in the tariff being imposed, we would see A becomes part of producer surplus now, and no longer part of all of that consumer surplus that took you all the way down to the world price. C becomes government revenue, which is that new item that we see here. And then B and D become part of total surplus as a result of this. And in terms of what's going to be produced, still produced domestically, in terms of what's supplied domestically at Q2, but what is demanded as a result of this at C2 is going to be produced and imported as a result of this. And you're going to see some aspects in which there isn't items going to be demanded. The demand changes as a result of this. So everything that's supplied, you're going to have more domestic supply, but you're going to have less domestic demand as a result of this, kind of a chilling effect. And that is what leads us to this key graph in terms of the effect of a tariff. Notice it doesn't go all the way to the autarky. But it does have an impact here in terms of A becomes a part of producer surplus again. Again, B and E are looked at as kind of deadweight loss, because it's areas that wouldn't necessarily be produced because of what's being sold at the tariff price, compared to free trade, of course. C and D is going to be your tariff, so that's going to be going to the government revenue mailbox. And then what is going to be produced domestically would be at QA. What's going to be demanded at domestically would be at QB, and the difference will be what is imported between QA and QB would be the imports that we would see there. Okay, so that's the impact of tariffs on this particular model. One more to talk about before we close out this chapter, and that is the idea of a quota or placing a legal limit, a particular quantity on the number of imports that are coming in. And the best way to talk about this is really to look at that in this particular model. And here we see the quota kind of replaces the tariff. So the money, the money that was normally C&D is actually going abroad. So this is actually a quota is actually leading to a higher price domestically that producers can produce. So A still becomes a part of producer surplus. But B, C, D, and E now become part of deadweight loss because C and D essentially is going to quota rent that's going to or other countries, other companies in other countries. So that money is actually going out of the country. So it's almost better that you would use a tariff here than a quota because the consumers are still paying the tariff price, but the government isn't getting any revenue from these quotas. The foreign producers are, and so C&D is actually money that it's going along with the price of the product to other nations. So that's where economists talk about this all the time, but there are drawbacks to the tariff too. But in terms of keeping money domestically, that is where it is an added incentive to have a tariff as opposed to a quota, which is why President Trump likes the tariffs as opposed to the quotas, because it does bring in revenue, and he was doing that with a lot of Chinese goods in order to pay for farmers to offset what farmers weren't getting in orders from China and other places as a result of that. So kind of seeing that model of tariffs having more of an impact, being able to be used for other types of subsidies and things you could use. And with a quota, you wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, so there's lots of back and forth on this whole idea of trade protection. Is it a national security issue? Boeing being a good example of that. The government does not want a company like Boeing to go under. Why? Because they make planes, and they could also make warplanes if needed down the road. They see that as a national security issue, so they're going to continue to bail that company out. So if ever there was a stock to invest in, that's probably a good one because long term, because of the idea that they're not going to go under. The government's never going to let them fail. Another aspect of trade protection is job creation. How do we protect trade and protect industries, kind of the infant industry argument, but cottage industries, industries that have been there for a long time, and protect those jobs. Infant industries are what we call incubator industries, in which we are trying to help them and give them support. Technology is a good example here of trying to do that. How do we protect those, at least in the short term, in order to get them going, and then we'll, kind of let them do their own thing. And for a long time, the reason why there was no sales tax on items that were purchased on the internet, if you bought from a company that was online, as long as they weren't present in your state, the idea was you had no sales tax. And the reason was because of an infant industry. They were trying to get web companies off the ground. And startups, a lot of them were very web-based in nature. And different state governments saw that as an advantage to help get them off the ground and get them moving and running and getting people to buy from those companies, especially if they were based in your state, and giving them that sales tax benefit. So a lot of that's gone away now because we've been 25 years of the internet or whatever it is, and so we don't see as much of that today. So even though there are deadweight losses created by some of the quotas and the tariffs and other things, protections that are put in place, they see the cost-benefit analysis as being greater by protecting jobs, national security, and new technologies and innovation, which definitely you could make the argument for that. Okay, well, I hope you found this helpful. This ends part 2 of Unit 1, looking at chapters 3 and 17. We will be back for Unit 2, looking at chapters 23 and 24 coming up next. So live the 5, and we'll see you in Unit 2.